story recently about a couple who made the trip from Connecticut down to visit a couple friends of theirs in New York City. And this couple, John and Susan, made the trip, and they said they were going to have a late lunch with their friends, Pete and Jerry, at their home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So John and Susan show up for lunch, and John is one of those guys who just loves to hear the sound of his own voice. So he sits down to lunch and he just talks and talks and talks, barely pausing to breathe, let alone to eat. So this lunch becomes a very long affair. And Pete and Jerry had a young daughter named Faith, who was only 3 years old. So as many of you know, with young children, they can only tolerate so much talking and lunching, right? And so Faith had eventually been excused from the table and was given free range in the whole house while the adults were seated talking. So Pete and Jerry could hear Faith play, you could see her from time to time, but eventually as the lunch went longer and longer, they realized there was silence in the house. Some of you are smiling because if you ever have young children, you know the moment it's silent is when you're in trouble. You need to go check on them to see what they're up to. So Jerry, though, felt stuck in the moment because here she is in this lunch conversation trying to respect John, who's just droning on and on and on, but she's panicking because she hasn't heard or seen her daughter in a long time, so she doesn't know what to do. She doesn't want to be rude to her guest and interrupt him, but yet she's freaking out because she hasn't seen her daughter. So she's torn internally, and eventually she just says, I have to go check on Faith, and interrupts the conversation, gets up from the table to go find her daughter. She searches the entire house and doesn't find Faith anywhere. So she cries out to her husband, Pete, and they both instantly have this moment of panic and realization that perhaps Faith is in the pool. So they run outside only to find their 3-year-old daughter stark naked, standing tiptoes in the middle of the pool. That was a moment that forever changed Pete and Jerry's life, because they had been so caught up in this conversation of trying to be a people pleaser and trying to look like they had their life all together when their own daughter almost drowned in the pool. Now, miraculously, they got there in time to rescue her, or else that story would have had a very different ending. But this is the story of how the book Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Pete Scadero begins. Pete is the pastor and founder of a church in New York City called New Life Fellowship Christian Church. And him and his wife have started this ministry called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. So I want to begin by giving credit where credit is due, that a lot of material we're going to explore together over the next couple weeks comes from Pete and Jerry and this book and their ministry together. And what they realized that day when their daughter almost drowned is that while the surface of their life looked great, that they were pastors at this new multi-ethnic growing church in New York City, underneath the surface, they were drowning and they were struggling in their life. And so that moment of seeing their daughter in the pool led them on this transformational journey to start this ministry called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And what they realized on that journey is that all of us are like icebergs. That's why the picture is up here of an iceberg. All of us have 10% of our lives that is visible to everyone else above the surface, right? What we say or what we do, that top part of the iceberg. And we might even be mindful of what we say or do, or try to clean up our act, or go to church, or do devotions and try to live a good life. But all of us also have 90% of ourselves underneath the surface, that very few other people actually get to see that part of our lives. And if we're honest, sometimes that 90% of us that we try to keep hidden from everybody else, there's some deep brokenness and woundedness in that. Things that we need to process, or things we're afraid of, but we're afraid to process that stuff with other people in our lives. We're even sometimes afraid to process that with Jesus, which is kind of crazy because Jesus knows everything about us, but yet we're afraid to confront those areas in our life. And so over the next couple weeks, we're going to go on this journey of processing that 90% of our life material. And why that's so important is because what we don't transform, we will transmit. What you don't transform, you will transmit. We know the phrase that hurting people hurt people. And so if we don't do the own good, powerful healing work in our own lives, we will pass that hurt on, often to the people closest to us. In fact, that's why there are no perfect people and no perfect parents and no perfect families, because we often keep transferring our pain and brokenness from one generation to the next, where you can literally see lines of addiction or of greed or materialism, you name it, generation after generation in families, because we don't do the hard work of allowing Jesus to transform that 90% of our lives. You could have had the best childhood out there, but I can guarantee none of us enter adulthood without wounds. Your family could look like the picture-perfect family on the outside, but I can guarantee you, if you looked underneath the surface, you'd find stories of shame, of secrets, of brokenness, of broken relationships, or failed expectations, or unmet needs for unconditional love. That all of us have this brokenness in our lives. And so what are we to do about that? Is there any hope for us that we can at least partially interrupt that generational system? Is there any hope of healing and being set free? And so to talk about this morning, I want to look at a story found in Luke chapter 5, beginning in verse 27. Luke chapter 5, beginning in verse 27. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Levi got up, left everything, and followed Jesus. Then Levi gave a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table with them. The Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to his disciples, asking, "Why do you eat and drink with the tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but the sinners to repentance." Jesus is walking along, and he sees this guy named Levi at a tax collector's booth. What this probably tells us is actually Levi was a toll collector, which is a little different than a tax collector like Zacchaeus that we talked a couple weeks ago. Zacchaeus is more like the IRS. Levi is more like the PA Turnpike, if you think about that in your life. So a toll collector, he would set up a booth along the road, and an ancient road, everything was taxed. We're talking roads that you traveled on, your cart that you might pull along, even the wheels on your cart were taxed. And so that's what Levi's doing. He's this toll collector, taxing people as they go along the turnpike. And so you can imagine he's not a very popular guy, right? Nobody likes to pay a toll. And to make it worse, how the system was set up is that it would go to the highest bidder. So basically people could bid on getting Levi's job, and the person who paid the most money would get the job. So Levi clearly shelled out the most money to get the job, and now he could charge as much as he wanted to exploit people as they traveled along the road. So this is Levi's job, and as you can imagine, people didn't like toll collectors. Nobody likes paying that money on the turnpike. And so this was Levi's job, and one day Jesus walks by and calls Levi to follow him, which is absolutely shocking that Jesus would call a toll collector that nobody liked to follow him. And what I think is even more shocking is that Levi said yes, that there was something about Jesus' presence that drew Levi to him, that he left his money and his greed and his corruption to follow Jesus. And he's so excited to follow Jesus that he throws this huge party that Levi could definitely afford. And he invites all of his friends, and the only community Levi has, because everybody hates him, are other toll collectors. So he has this party of other toll collectors, invites Jesus and his disciples to come. And in the time of Jesus, banquets or parties were a public affair, meaning everybody knew what was going on, and so even if you weren't invited, you would come sometimes to look and see what was going on at the party from a distance. So the Pharisees get wind about this party going on, and they see Jesus hanging out, eating with the toll collectors. But the Pharisees aren't even bold enough to ask Jesus directly, so they are pansies, and they go over to the disciples and like, "Hey, why are you hanging out with the toll collectors?" And Jesus catches wind of what's going on and says, "I didn't come for the unhealthy. I didn't come for the healthy, but for the unhealthy. Not for the righteous, but for the sinners." And church, this is incredibly good news for you and me, that Jesus comes for broken, messed up people like you and me, with that 90% of stuff in our life, of wounds, of brokenness, of mistakes that we've made. Jesus says, I've come for you. That's why I'm here. And some of us know that we have messed up, that we have some baggage and stuff in our lives. But some of us, maybe, if we're honest, we kind of think we're like the Pharisees, that we think we have our lives together. Maybe it's not so bad. But we're all in this boat together, right? As Beth so beautifully read for us in 1 Timothy 1:15, Paul, one of the greatest missionaries of all time, called himself the chief of all sinners. If Paul thought that he was the chief of all sinners, then what does that make us, right? We're all in this boat together. But the good news is that Jesus comes to offer to set us free, to bring healing to that 90% of our lives. And so I want to take just a moment to go through what are some of these symptoms of emotionally unhealthy spirituality. Basically, how do you know if you're experiencing that currently in your life, or if you have in the past? And so I have a slide of just 8 things of where you might know if you're experiencing emotionally unhealthy spirituality. Amy did a great job of putting it on for us over here. There's actually 10 in the book. I boiled it down to 8 to make the sermon a little shorter, so you're welcome. But the first one is you may be experiencing emotionally unhealthy spirituality if you're using God to run from God. What I mean by that is maybe you come to church on Sunday, maybe you're doing your devotions, maybe you serve, maybe you're doing all these things for God, but it's just this checklist where you're just checking the box. And you're so busy doing stuff for God that you're never spending time with God. You're never just pausing to be still and to listen to God. You're not allowing God to transform your life. In fact, you're so busy doing for God that you can't actually take time to process that 90% of the pain of your life to allow Jesus to set you free. The second is that you may be dying to the wrong things. There's that famous verse where when we follow Jesus, we pick up our cross daily and deny ourselves to follow after Jesus. But what we sometimes do with that verse is that we think God's calling us to die to the good things in our life, to like joy and beauty and creativity. But that's never what God asks us to die to. God does ask us to die to our anger, our jealousy, our greed, our hatred and discord, but not the good things of life. In fact, God calls us to the abundant life in Jesus Christ. The third one, and Carol, if you could jump ahead to the third one, is that you are denying the impact of the past on the present. When we follow Jesus, we are indeed a new creation, but sometimes we then think, I never have to look back. I don't have to think about the past anymore. The past is in the past. I've got to let it go. Do I got any Frozen fans out there? Let it go, right? Just don't think about it anymore. But instead, we have to be willing to examine the impact of the past and see how it's showing up or impacting our present. I mentioned this story a couple weeks ago, but I have a really close friend who lost her father when she was just 17 years old. And for a really long time, she never processed that event in her past. And it wasn't until she had the courage to process that pain from that wound in her life that she could see how it was impacting her present, that she found healing to move forward into the future. So we have to be willing to view and explore the past impact on the present. The fourth one is that we can be experts at compartmentalizing. I don't know if I'm the only one that does this, but sometimes we love to have little boxes where we keep everything's neat and tidy, right? I see a couple head nods. We can do the same in our spiritual life, right? We have the God box where we come to church on Sunday morning, maybe we do devotion, but we just keep God in the God box, and we don't let God to influence any other part of our life. In fact, we might come to church on Sunday and sing and worship, then we go out in the parking lot and we curse out somebody on the Carlisle Pike, right? So we compartmentalize. We just had this great time, now we're yelling at somebody on the pike. Or you do your devotions in the morning only to yell at your spouse or your kids when you're running out the door, right? We compartmentalize and try to keep God in the box. But instead, we need to be willing to allow God to influence every area of our life. How we work, how we rest, how we play, spend our time and money, how we parent and show up in our families. So if you compartmentalize, that might be a sign of emotionally unhealthy spirituality. The fifth is that we sometimes spiritualize conflict. Not too many people out there like conflict, but conflict is the price we pay for deeper intimacy. That if we're willing to engage in healthy conflict with someone, it can actually sometimes draw that relationship to a deeper and healthier point. But instead, we get afraid of conflict, so we try to sweep it under the rug, we try to pretend it didn't happen or it doesn't exist, and we draw back away from other people and withdraw and become more and more isolated and more conflicted and divided. And so if you try to spiritualize away conflict, that may be a sign of emotionally unhealthy spirituality. The sixth is that sometimes we cover over our brokenness, or we ignore our emotions like anger and frustration. And it's okay to feel your emotions. In fact, part of having emotions is what it means to be human and to be created in the image of God. We don't have to be controlled by our emotions, but we should be willing to feel them and to process them, to wrestle with our emotions, to see what they have to teach us. That we don't have to pretend that they don't exist, but we can be honest with our emotions and in our brokenness in our life. The seventh is that we live without limits. Sometimes it can be really hard to say a very short, simple word, no. It can be so hard to say that word because we don't want to disappoint others. We want to live up to other people's expectations. We want to think that we are invincible and we can do it all, but we can't. Because we are finite human beings that have limits on our time and our energy and our resources. So sometimes saying no is the best thing you can say, the healthiest thing that you can say. That's a way of taking care of yourself, of being a good steward of the only gift that you have, the life that God has given you. So sometimes it's okay to say no, that we don't have to keep people pleasing and living without limits. And then the last one is judgmentalism or judgment. We love to judge people for all sorts of things, for their hairstyle, or their hair color, or their work preferences, or their lifestyle preferences. You name it, we love to judge people for everything. And sometimes we even judge people from their spiritual lives. That somehow we think that it's our personal job to be the fixer, to fix everyone and everything. And that we get so caught up in the speck in somebody else's eye that we ignore the log in our own eye. So sometimes we fall into this cycle of judgment, and that's another characteristic of emotionally unhealthy spirituality. So I invite you to look at this list and just think about what one or two or three of these really resonate with you, of maybe where you're at personally or you have in your life. And I'll be honest with you, I can relate to all of these at different seasons in my life. And for you to be honest with yourself of where do you see these symptoms of emotionally unhealthy spirituality where you're at right now today. And as you're reflecting on that, the good news is that Jesus wants to heal you and set you free, to give you an emotionally healthy and spiritually rich and depth life and journey with Jesus. And so today is really just the beginning, the intro to this journey, that I'm inviting us all together on this journey over the next 7 weeks as we explore these areas together and go deeper to be healed and set free. If you like this little taste of where we're going, everyone's also invited to stick around after the worship service today, where we're going to have an all-church-led Bible study for people of all ages, where we're going to go deeper into these topics together. But to give you a little taste of that right now in this moment, I want you to look at this list one more time and cement in your mind which ones really stand out to you where you're at right now. And then Carl's going to play some music. And I'm just going to invite you, as you feel led and feel comfortable, just to share perhaps one or two with your neighbors next to you. This is a judgment-free zone. We are all in this together, but it helps us see that we're not alone, that we are all on this journey towards seeking emotional health and spiritual depth with Jesus. So I'm going to invite you to go ahead and start playing, and as you feel led, to go ahead and share with your neighbors from